So it is another Heresy Hump day, because it is, for me, Tuesday evening, but for you guys, probably Wednesday. And so, yeah, I've got a couple topics tonight, a couple of the usual sort of format. I do have my sponsor that I'll be showing in a moment, and I have a table update that I'll show, and some of that will be a follow-up to those of you that saw the Musty Wargamers. I'll be showing a up-close camera of my progress on terrain and other things. And I have two topics tonight. I have sort of a big topic that's going to take most of the show, I believe, and then I have a small topic. Or actually, I have three topics. I'm going to start with a shout-out for Fritz 40K and him returning, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And then I have my main topic tonight, which is an esoteric Heresy Hump Day classic topic. It is multi-dimensional rule sets. And then lastly, losing your favorite paint, or when you can no longer get your favorite paint. And so just a little bit of topic about that. So I will start with the sponsor this evening. Now, while I was away for Easter, and I hope everyone had a nice holiday weekend, but that was a while ago still, but I guess I saw you guys during Heresy Hump Day, but I'm just Musty Wargamers. But I got a gift from my mother-in-law, and it is a Glenfiddich that I've never had before. This is sort of late in the Scotch season for me to open a new bottle usually, but I decided to open and hold it and wait for this moment on Heresy Hump Day to open it. Now, I have opened it, so I don't have to go through all the unwrapping and everything, but yeah, I've got the can and everything here. This is a 14-year Glenfiddich. Rich oak is what it's described as. I have had three different kinds of Glenfiddich. I've had their standard 12-year. I've had more top of the line that I've had is their 18-year. And then my favorite is what I believe is the 15-year, which is the one that's soaked in the sherry casks. And that's always been my favorite one, that middle one. This one, the Rich Oak 14-year-old, I've never had. It says matured for 14 years and then delicately finished in New American and New Spanish oak to create a complex harmony of lively fruit flavors and rich new oak. Now, I tend to like that when they do that for things like beer, for like the IPA, the India Pale Ale is, classically something that was transported in oak casks and had the oak flavor. So I do like that. So I'm very interested to see how this one is going to taste. Okay. Unlike my 500 video, where I waited forever to taste it and then freaked out on camera, I'm going to do this like right now. I definitely taste the oak. It's nice. It might end up being out of the four, my second favorite now, like my second place. I still think I like the 15-year with the sherry the best, where it's soaked in the sherry casks, but who knows? This one might grow on me. I do like this one quite a bit. it's got a nice flavor. It's definitely got that strong oak sort of after flavor, which is really nice. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do my table update, and then I'll go into my shout out. So we'll go to the table update. So I have a fair bit of progress on my tree plates. I did take some pictures to show from when I was showed last time, when I just had the bare boards and not much done on them, how I created the circular molds for the tree plates. What I ended up doing, I'll just show the molds here. Basically, I took epoxy sculpt and I put discs in, and these discs here, they may have looked like bases to people, but really, all they weren't bases. I didn't actually pay any extra money for these. These were actually the inserts in the MDF kits for my paint pots. And so the MDF paint pot holder. So I had like this, the layered, mini layered paint pot holder, and this was for the GW paints. And these would pop out, and then you'd put your paint in, and I saved them, and I've got a lot of them. And they ended up being perfect to just put these trees on. Now, I essentially would put this down, tack it down, and then put my epoxy sculpt around it, and brush it up with a sculpting tool, and create that ridge here. And then I would essentially kind of move it around just slightly a little bit, just to give it some space. But what I had in the end were these really nice sort of craters, and you can see that in the picture. And then from there, once those had cured, and I kind of did the same thing with the swamps, and I'll show the swamps in a bit too, except instead of doing a perfectly round disc, I ended up just creating an irregular shape, that just to be able to have an area to put polyurethane clear liquid and to harden later, just to have that look. But then what I ended up doing is using a mix of plaster, water, and a little bit of glue and some paint to create to level out all of this, so it actually it doesn't stand out too much like it would in the picture, and level that out. And I also, with the plaster, and used paper towel sliced up and made essentially plaster cloth to create irregular shapes here. So it's not all just completely smooth and sculpted, it's also the irregular shapes of the plaster cloth. And I think it came out nice. I initially was going to magnetize, and then I saw how it was going to raise the tree, but I also saw how it had a pretty decent fit. Like, they don't actually move heavily, like, you know, and so I will be able to pull these out, and some are a little stiffer than others, but for the most part they're good. And then I'll also be able to use these just on a table if I just want the tree on the table alone. I do have some extras. And so overall, like, I'm not finished with this. I've done a dry brushing on a darker brown. I still have to paint the stones where there are stones, like that one here, and I'm going to do another wash. But I'm getting really close, like for the tree plates. I have a larger tree plate that I'm not going to show, but it basically looks the same, and it's got 4 trees. But I'll just quickly show a couple of the other things. These will end up being my swamps, and they don't really look that impressive yet. They really just look kind of similar to the tree plates, just without trees. And you can see just where the water is to go in here to create swamps. But the idea will be, and as you can see, I have unpainted stones here, but the idea will be that I will put Minwax polyurethane clear in here to create the sort of water effect, and then I'm going to have tall grass essentially throughout spots to create a real swampy look with the water and the tall grass. So I think that will come out nice. And so these are pretty simple right now, but that's kind of where I'm at with those. This one might be my favorite one. This one is just completely epoxy sculpt. There is no plaster. The other one I should have said, but all of those swamps were just completely done the same way as the trees without the trees. So there was plaster, you know, creating a well, and then, epoxy sculpt creating a well, and then plaster filling in the entire surface. This one is all epoxy sculpt, and I think if you see it, it actually has some really nice shadows and ridges, you know, just from all the sculpting. I really enjoyed doing this one. And then the stones themselves were, I think I mentioned, epoxy sculpt that I had done earlier, and they have to be painted. They're not actually painted yet and complete. And I will do a wash on this like the other ones. So I'm really liking that for rocky ground. Lastly, this one is plaster for the ground, but then this is all epoxy sculpt. And I kind of showed this on the Musty Wargamers, but it was kind of hard to see. Now, despite it being white, it's not painted yet. You can see where I got paint on the bottom. But I am going to paint this and do some washes and dry brushing on the ruin itself. And I'll be doing all of these plates, I should have mentioned after the washes, I'll be doing flock and foliage and things. And on this one, I'm looking at doing some ivy and moss in it to make it look. I had a suggestion by a viewer, subscriber, that when I did the tower, to put some moss, you know, in the tower itself. And it was a really nice suggestion. It was just like to maybe put turf, and I just never got around to it. But I think, thinking back to that suggestion, that since this is a ruin, that I'm likely going to put, after I paint and dry brush and wash, I'm going to put some fine turf in different spots to create like that moss effect. And I'll do flock all over it, but I'm also going to do some strands of ivy and stuff too on there as well. Yeah, so I think that should be very cool. I know that, just really quick, I know some of you have seen this now several times, but I've never really shown these off well when I've tried to show these, because I've only showed the metal. And during the Musty Wargamers, it was kind of really far away to look at these, but these are the guys and gals that I'll be painting up pretty soon. I've just been sort of completely focused on the other stuff that I've been working on, and let's turn the light on here. So this is sort of the German officer, and the Tarzan guy, female explorer, the usurper, and then of course this is the guy that will be in the cosmic game, sort of sci-fi pulp game by Lucidai, and so I'm really looking forward to that. It should be great. So yeah, I'll be working on them very soon. The cosmic one from the Lucidai actually had a different kind of base. Like, it came with the base, which was interesting, but I still put them on another base as well. Alright, I'm going to go back to the chat. Okay, we are back on the chat. And so next what I wanted to do is I wanted to do a shout out for Fritz 40K. I believe his new YouTube channel is called Wargamer Fritz, but I will put it below in the description. Many of you are going to know who Fritz is. Some of you may not. He had a YouTube channel that was on for a very long time. It inspired many people to do YouTube channels for wargaming, and had quite a lot of subscribers. I'm guessing, I don't really know, but I believe it was, you know, it was in the tens of thousands, so like it was probably around 20,000 or 30,000, I'm guessing. Fritz is definitely one of those channels that I watched when just getting onto YouTube for wargaming. He inspired me in a lot of different ways for gaming. Now, I interpreted, you know, Fritz's channel is very big into tactical discussions on gaming and the tactics of gaming. I wouldn't say that he focuses, as much as he supports the idea of hobbying and having painted miniatures and things like that, like he kind of focuses on the tactical aspect of gaming and sort of the love of the gaming component. And so that's kind of where you really see his passion come through on his channel. Now, he did sort of step away from YouTube for a bit, and now, thankfully, he's actually back and with this channel. Subscriber count is not what it was before, because many people don't even know that he's back yet. And so if you were a subscriber before, by all means, the link is below and to his new channel. And the kind of content, for those of you that don't know who he is, his old channel was called Fritz 40K, and I would have to say that Warhammer 40K is definitely his main game. But having said that, even a main game like on his channel, because of the breadth and amount that he puts on there, still may only be and sometimes 20% of the content. I mean, like, he does so much content of so many different things. And he's really big into Battletech as well. He's really big into X-Wing, the X-Wing miniatures. He's also into role-playing, so he does a lot of discussions on Dungeons & Dragons. Zombicide is one of the things that I really liked watching his channel for when I was getting into Zombicide. For those of you into the more historical stuff, he has actually talked about Chain of Command as a game that he likes to regularly play, and he also likes Wings of Glory, just to name a few, and so, like, for a couple of historical things. And so yeah, definitely check it out. I find his discussions really great, and I'm actually going to reference one of them today, because my main topic today, I already had some examples that I wanted to talk about, but actually just today I watched a video on his channel where he really gave an excellent example of something that I had been thinking about already. And I just felt like I had to use it in our chat and reference that today. And so, yeah, so with that said, I'm going to take a sip, and then we'll go on to our first main topic of the evening. So, I wanted to talk about multi-dimensional rule sets. Now, I guess you could also call this like layering kind of separate levels of superimposed rules within a rule set, as opposed to, and I'll explain this a little bit more. This is a bit esoteric, and many people may call this different things, but I was playing DBA, so a historical 6mm game, or 15mm is what we were playing. And I was playing that. I've played that a number of times with a friend. And I was playing that game, and I was thinking a lot about it, because I really like the game. And I find it has a lot of opportunities for like immersing your brain into thinking about strategy while you're playing, and tactics. Now, this is mass battles, of course, and I know many of you that are regular commenters on the channel have played it, just from talking to folks. I was thinking about how much I like the game and different aspects to it. I was talking to my friend as we were playing, and I was just saying, you know, you almost have two superimposed layers of rules that you kind of put on each other in this game. And what I mean by that is, you first have, in my mind, you first have the unit pieces on the table, and they're standard basing sizes, and so you have your terrain, and you have your table, and you have your rules for movement, and then you have your rules for how these pieces will then interact with not only the terrain but your opponent's pieces. And before you even think about the quality of your opponent's pieces and the nature of your opponent's pieces and yours, just there's almost a game in itself, just in the way you line up with your opponent's pieces, regardless of what they are, and then the flanking rules and the rules for sort of trapping your opponent, where you have like yourself up against an opponent. I guess we call it closing the door, but you have then one of your miniatures that can then trap them from being able to retreat safely. And so all of those rules, regardless of the quality of your miniatures, and by quality I just mean like the characteristics of your miniatures, there's like a rule set right there. And arguably you could have, it would be a simpler game, but you could have a strategic game where you could simply roll dice based on having the same quality of miniatures and utilizing this entire scheme in DBA in movement of your units and how they all interact with the terrain, the table, and each other. And you could have a game like just like that. But then DBA takes it where all of your miniatures, of course, have potentially different quality. And like, so you can have cavalry or knights, and you know, like you can have archers and just elephants, and you know, lots of different kinds of miniatures. And then when you go into the book, it will say that, you know, when this type of unit goes against this type of unit, this is how the combat situation looks, and what you need to roll, what each of you need to roll, and what your modifiers are based on the quality of one versus the other. Now, before you go further into the quality, because like you superimpose these two things on each other, like you're lining up and how you're flanking in things will affect those combat rolls. So that's how they're sort of superimposed, and that through the combat, the two types of quality match up, and then the rules from everything I talked about before will add modifiers to that. But then even within the quality, there are further rules, and depending on the actions that happen during the combat, if your unit is a particular type of unit, and I don't have them all memorized at this point, I'm not seasoned in DBA, but like certain types of units, if they flee from, let's say, knights, some will just retreat, some will just die. It's like a quick kill. And so you have like your second set of like your other dimension of rules where it's a sort of combat among quality, and then within the actions of that combat, it influences a easier lethality in some cases, or a lesser lethality, depending on how, the nature of the miniatures. But over here, you have really almost kind of like a separate dimension of rules. Now, some of you may be averse to me describing these as dimensions because I might want to put my tinfoil hat on here, but that's the way I kind of think about it. It's they're almost like independent mechanisms that you could have independently, but then the beauty of it is you actually, and what kicks it up a notch is that you actually superimpose them on top of each other. Now, I'm sure, without knowing of specific examples, that there are examples where you could have three sort of these levels where they're almost like independent mechanisms and things unto themselves that you could use independently of each other, but the game actually takes them and superimposes all three of them or two of them. And I was really intrigued by this because I really felt I find DBA to be a really elegant game, and I'm really impressed with it. I haven't shown it yet, but I do have an India Nation Army Ancients that I'm going to be painting up. And so that will be happening fairly soon among the many projects that I'm planning on doing. Now, I am going to translate this to Saga, and the topic is going to actually veer a bit, but this is the context of the topic. But before I do, today I watched a video by Fritz, and he was talking about how he called it hardware versus software for X-Wing miniatures. Now, I think his term hardware and software, he's using not just for X-Wing, because we're talking about spaceships. No, this is a topic that he brings up, and he's using X-Wing as the example. But what he's saying, for those of you that play X-Wing, which is a tabletop game where you have like Star Wars ships on a table, he was saying that most people seem to focus on the hardware within the game, which is the list building by how he defines it, and the quality of the miniatures and the cards that you can use. So your list building of your choice in ships, and then your list building with the types of special upgrades that you use on the ships. And by creating this list and a force, you're creating, you're competing at the level of the hardware and trying to outmatch your opponent by creating synergies within your fleet and synergies within your own ship in its upgrades. And I think many of us that play games can identify with that. Like, I immediately think of Warhammer 40K and how you do list building and you try to create a deadly list. But what he was saying is that to compete at the software level, you're actually, and what he feels can be harder sometimes or less done, is you're actually trying to hone your skill set on the table and being able to maneuver your ships without crashing them, without hitting asteroids, without going off the table, getting your ships into the appropriate positioning to have your firing arcs. Because for those of you that don't play it, there are spatial requirements within the game that, your primary weapons will not work if you don't have your enemy within your firing arc in many cases. There are exceptions to that. But now, as he was talking about this, I'm starting to think about quality, because I'd already had this topic prepared for today. And I'm thinking, well, the quality of the miniatures, the hardware, the software, the movement on the table, the spatial relationships of the ships, and getting people into firing arcs. And I'm thinking, you could actually have a game just with the software. Like, if all your ships were the same, if TIE Fighters and X-Wings were all the same, and you just had X-Wings on one side and TIE Fighters on the other, and if you just use the software of using the maneuver templates to move, the variety of maneuver templates to move your ships, and then basically using your firing arcs and the rules of the spatial relationships, you would have a simpler game, but potentially a game unto itself, just with that dynamic. And then you add the hardware as another level, and then you've got the quality of one ship versus another in the engagement and how it affects things. Now, there are interfaces when you do this, so your quality of your ship may have rules that change your firing arcs and your ability to move and your relationship with asteroids and things like that. Like, you could have a card that says, don't worry about the asteroid, in which case this dimension affects this dimension as you actually put them on top of each other. So this is just like my dimensions of rules, the multi-dimensions of rules, is my way of articulating something I have observed. But I think I independently tapped into a thought process that Fritz had talked about today in his video and named it something different, but I see a lot of parallels. And I was really encouraged by that, because it's just an interesting topic to me. I mean, you don't have to understand things like within this pattern, like, you don't have to do this, but it's just, if you're interested in gaming and how rules are made and, the quality of rules or how one rule set compares to another, sometimes these sort of concepts I find interesting. And I'm not traditionally trained, classically trained in rule sets. Like, I don't know the history of wargaming and how, I don't have like a formal training, if there is one, in how rules are designed. This is just all my observation. So, another sip. I hope you guys haven't gone to sleep yet. This is just sort of one of those really esoteric topics around rules and games that just have interested me in the last bit. And it started with DBA, that triggered it. But the triggering of the DBA initially made me draw parallels to Saga, and specifically the battle boards. Now, I completely forgive and understand those that don't like Saga. Not that they need forgiveness, but as somebody that likes Saga, I completely understand it. I know of several people that find the battle board system kind of gimmicky or gamey. Maybe they prefer something that they see more as a pure simulation, closer to a simulation-based historical game, and not one that's as mythic, in the Saga sense. The fact that the battle board has abilities that almost, in some cases, is like can be looked at as fantasy. Like, you could have, like, in Loki in the first edition, like, just literally using the Loki Saga ability, like killing two characters, and I understand that takes away from the experience for some people if they're looking for something that's strictly, in the presentation, interpreted as more simulation. And I say the word presentation of it very specifically, because you can call Loki whatever you want, that you can call it an ability. But at the end of the day, and I'm kind of jumping ahead of myself on this topic, but at the end of the day, it basically, the best way I could word it is, it leverages qualities across troops and armies that reflect tendencies and capabilities of a quality of a particular faction or a particular type of unit. And I'm going to get back to that because I want to first tie this into the two levels that I was talking about with the strategy, or I should say the hardware, software, and the multidimensional discussion that we were kind of in. Now, Saga has its own, whether it be version 1 or version 2, I'm not really speaking about one specifically, but it has its own rules for scenarios, movement, terrain, unit cohesion, how charges happen, how, movement happens, and, and even basically how units can come together in a battle initially, how range combat would happen. Like, all of this stuff has its own rules that, again, you could arguably say that it could be its own game if all of those units had the same quality and all those miniatures. And if there were no battle boards, you could argue that there's a structure and a dimension of a game based on the spatial relationships and the movement and all the things that I just mentioned. And again, it would be a simpler game, but it has the framework of all of those things, those interdependencies. But then you have, for Saga, the battle board. Now, there are also faction rules. So when you go in the book, like, each faction has a set of rules. And there are rules within those factions that affect that dimension. That first dimension I'm talking about of movement and all of those things. Like, you could literally have a unit like my mercenaries, Flemish mercenaries, like, their movement distance was less than others in the first edition, but their armor was better, and, like, it changed them based on that. And that's unit quality. But the faction rules within the book have things that change things. But pretty much you do have, like, a generic kind of dimension in that sense, like we've been talking about. Then the battle board for each faction changes things. And then now, really what you have is, when in Saga, when you get into the combat, after you've done that point where you come into contact, let's say for melee, you have, in both version 1 and 2, a sequence of events that take place where you follow a series of rules, but you have the ability to not only utilize your opponent's fatigue, which is interesting because that's what I would describe as an interfacing between the two dimensions, because everything you do in this first one with movement and even the history of the last round, but in particular, how many times you move and how many times you try to shoot, and all the things that you try to do generically in the beginning of the round, or the beginning of that unit's activation, will then translate into fatigue, which then when you get into this combat phase, it can be manipulated. And it's almost like a contact point between those two things. And then you have the battle board, which is a thing unto of itself that influences the combat sequence. You have the ability to manipulate what happens within the game due to your faction, and that is, to me, translated as a type of quality, because the quality of your faction is reflected within its battle board. And you can now manipulate how things are going to happen, and it's very strategic, because not only is some of it random, and then you have to deal with that randomness and try, and really you could argue that that's actually in all of these games, because we roll dice and there's randomness. But with that randomness, you then allocate how you're going to utilize the quality of your faction within various contact points within the game. And so it's interesting to me, because I see it as very similar to the same things that are happening in the other two games. It's just that in Saga they use the battle board. And for people that see the battle board as sort of a gimmicky thing, I think it's because they see this board on the side of the table that people are doing things with dice. But the reality is the information, it could easily just be in a different format. I mean, like, you could have the rules in the book and you could have it really set up differently and it would look maybe a little bit different, but really it would still just be rules that are based on quality of your troops that you're using. And the only difference is that it's essentially a random table, because you have these things available to you and then you roll dice and you randomly get the ability to utilize certain strengths with those dice to then match up with your abilities. And it's just presented as a board, which I like, and I know some people find it maybe gamey. Now, in defense of the battle board, you know, if you don't like it, that's fine. I mean, like, it's just, if people don't like that style of game, you know, and having that, focusing on that as well as the table and, you know, the miniatures and things, I understand that. But really, I see the strengths of your faction in the battle board and the abilities, although they may be presented in a mythic sort of saga fashion, that could have like a sort of fantasy or mythic element. Really, if you wanted to go pure historical, like in your head, you could really still do the battle board, in that most people, I think, would agree that throughout history, there were within various armies and nations core competencies and capabilities within their military to be specialized in certain ways that gave them an edge over their counterparts. You could say that, you know, Napoleon was incredible with using artillery, and, you know, his ability to bring artillery, as I understand it, was really practically unparalleled, like, for its time, and that was a big part of his military success. And so if you were having a saga game, hypothetically, that had Napoleon and his troops in it instead of like the Viking Age, you could argue that maybe there should be the potential to use an ability that not is just artillery that's as good as your opponent's artillery and equally balanced, but the ability at times to pull something out of the hat and actually have an advantage with artillery. And so at the end of the day, that's really what the saga abilities are doing, is they're actually giving you core competencies for a faction. And, you know, it does it in a way that is flavorful in the way saga is presented as a game. But you could make an argument that it could be hussars that are just really good cavalry and considered to be like perhaps creme de la creme, you know, of the cavalry of a particular time. And having those hussars should have a capability on the battle board to potentially sometimes use if the right event, you know, things come together, and that's, you know, having the dice and being able to use it at the right time at the right moment. And that's another thing. It's just, you know, in defense again of the battle board, is that, you know, like, I realize in war games we like things balanced, and, you know, we want oftentimes one army to go against the next, and, like, you know, your cavalry to be as good as their cavalry, and like your, you know, number of troops to be the same as their number of troops. But at the end of the day, and I think Saga tries to do that with the point system, you know what I mean, like, you know, as far as number of troops and things, but we oftentimes do like to reflect how certain units and miniatures have an exceptional quality as compared to another kind. And at the end of the day, I think that's kind of what the battle board is doing, is it's actually trying to leverage those things. And you know, in any game, I think it's hit and miss. But I think that it's sort of a really, really fun system. And I really do think that for folks that are really critical but haven't played it, of the battle board sort of system, I think that rather than just dismiss it as that's just fantasy sort of dice rolling that changes the game in a way that's just not a simulation, I think you need to be a little more open-minded about it, in that really you need to potentially consider that it's just rules that are just on a board instead of in your book. And there's a randomness that we always have, like within wargaming, to reflect the randomness that can happen. And that it's reflecting the quality of your faction and the other person's quality of their faction, and it's instilled in the board rather than just in your rules for your army in your book. And so I wanted to sort of merge that together with the discussion of the multi-dimensions of rules, because I feel that the battle board is a dimension of Saga that's superimposed on the core mechanics of Saga, and then it creates something greater when you put the two together. And I think that in the end, that really is the attempt from any of these games, is to create something greater by having many of these almost distinct dimensions of rules that you can see could be utilized unto themselves in many examples, but when then put together, they just create something greater. And I think you could probably argue that there are games out there that have maybe just one dimension of rules in this regard and are simpler and perhaps very fun. Perhaps that one dimension also creates a level of spatial arrangement and competition among even similar units that it could actually be quite fun and difficult. It just forces your brain to go one particular direction just heavily, whereas other games may be a little simpler, in one respect in that dimension, but then have a whole other one they superimpose on top of it with contact points, and then it is actually equally as fun in a different way. So I hope that this doesn't seem to be me speaking gibberish about rules tonight. It's almost like I feel like I'm creating my own gaming language here. I'm glad that I saw Fritz's video and he talked about something, in my opinion, similar and had his own language on it. It makes me feel not too weird. So, I think this one's going to be a bit of a quick Heresy Hump Day, but I was kind of also just musing. I went to the store this week, and this next topic is about losing your favorite paints. And many people that have been longtime Games Workshop Citadel fans probably can sympathize with having the line change, and then all of a sudden, like, what do you do? And it was funny, because that doesn't happen to me often, and I actually enjoy my coat to arms stuff, and although I find it to be really similar to the older versions of Citadel that I've either used or seen in the past, but many people are really diehard. They'd rather get dried up paints and try to rehydrate them and have that pigment tone that they're used to than to try to use something different. And to some degree, I think it's nostalgic too. Like, like you just enjoy that because you're used to it. But I have key paints. I should do a video someday of my favorite paints, but one of my favorites is, I'm not big on the game color line, but there are a couple that I really do like because I've just gotten used to them over time, and maybe their consistency. Most of my issues with game color is that I've had a couple that were quite watery and just I didn't like the consistency. I got a couple, and I've seen it on more than one occasion with the same color. But this charred brown by Game Color, I really, really like, because it's a really nice sort of burnt, ashy brown. It doesn't have like a whole lot of that red kind of look, and like for those of you that have looked at all different colors of brown, like how there's different kind of variations and other colors that augment the brown to make it go a different way. Well, I find this one's a really nice dark one, and I'm trying to remember. I think I've never used Rhinox Hide by GW, but that was like the closest one that I could think of. Maybe Dryad Bark or something. Like, I don't really use the GW dark browns, and so I know of the names, and I've kind of looked at them in the pot. I don't know which one's most comparable to this, but I love this so much, and I've gone through so many pots of it. Another one that I really love is just Earth by Game Color. I use this a ton. Like, all my Musket and Tomahawk spaces are Earth with Agrex Earthshade and other techniques on it, but the base color is Earth. And so I'm in my game store, and I'm getting three things that I use a lot of, and that's Ivory by Model Color, Satin Varnish I use a lot of, and by Vallejo, and then Charred Brown. And I could not find the Charred Brown no matter how much I looked. I swear I looked through every single spot, through the entire Game Color section, through the technical paints, by Vallejo, and that were in that stand with it, and I looked everywhere, and I swear I could not find it. I mean, I was coming home from work and just quickly running in to get a couple of things, and then going home after working on the weekend. I didn't even want to be in the game store. I just wanted to go in there, and I do drive by it on the way home, and so it was convenient. And finally, I did just mention to somebody that I know that works at the store, and I just sort of said, like, just smiling, like, oh gosh, like, it looks like I'm out of luck because I just don't think they make game color charred brown anymore. And he looked it up on his computer and said, well, there's supposed to be 6 bottles there. And so he went over there. He was able to find it when I wasn't. But it made me laugh because it made me, immediately I was just had this, like, I'm dealing with this situation, like I'm looking at the Rhinox hide and I'm Rhinox brown or whatever it is by GW, and I'm thinking, like, what am I bringing home instead? You know, and I'm also having to do this quick, which kind of made me a little nervous too, because it's a few bucks, but at the same time, I'm kind of committing to something that I'm thinking is really close, like right off the bat. So I'm curious, how many of you guys run into a situation where you have like a tried and true paint that you use, and then like all of a sudden you can't find it anymore? And one, does that kind of make you go crazy? And two, how easy is it usually for you to find a substitute? I guess it would make a difference if, like, it's the main color for your army and you've been painting it up all along. You have a huge army, and then all of a sudden you got to go to a different company or something and try to find a similar shade, and you're worried that that's going to be the case. That's really not the case for this. I use this more to augment stuff. Like, I either use it for earth and things. Well, I use earth a lot, but I use this for some sort of mud or something to do with the base. Or I end up using it for, like, when I want to do, like, a dark leather, you know, brown on a miniature. So it's always to augment something. But funny enough, I don't find that there's, like, tons of options for this particular shade of brown. And so it made me quite nervous at the time, and I was then really relieved that I was able to find it. Now, I know you can mix your own paint, and you could just take, in this case, perhaps black, and mix in with a type of brown to try to emulate that. And that might, in the end, in some cases, be pretty good. You may introduce a level of gray into it, depending on how much black. You might almost have an ashy grayish look develop, depending on how much black you put in and the balance that you find. I do mix paints at times, and I just, for your tried and true ones, in some ways, it's a nice thing is that you don't have to mix them. You can just, they're ones that you're used to, you love them, and you can just use them right out of the pot. And it's sort of like a tool in your tool belt. So I was just curious how you guys react to that, and if you have experiences that are similar to mine. So, well, this is a bit of a short one. Not that short, I suppose, but I hope you guys are having a good week, and I will talk to you later. Take care.